They said the house hadn't changed. But the air lied first. It met me at the porch like an old secret, heavy, familiar, and waiting. I heard the hinges breathe as the door opened, and the man who wasn't my father stood there, smiling like he'd practiced the expression in a mirror. "Welcome back," he said. Something in his voice split the moment in two. The sound hit harder than anything that followed. Sharp, hollow, rehearsed. Every cell in me froze between wanting to belong and knowing I shouldn't have come. The world blinked once, then steadied into a silence that pressed against my skin. The porch still carried the ghosts of my father's lessons. The scent of sawdust, the rhythm of measured wood, the echo of his calm authority. But now that rhythm belonged to someone else. The floorboards remembered the truth, even if the people didn't. I saw in that man's eyes a lesson older than either of us, how power wears kindness like camouflage. He didn't need to raise his hand for me to understand who ruled this house now. The real blow came from the certainty that this moment wasn't personal. It was ritual, a script, passed down through men who learned to own rooms by breaking silence first. That's when I understood what we call family is often just the first institution that teaches obedience. The first system that trades love for control, warmth for dominance, belonging for silence. And I had stepped straight back into it, thinking I was coming home. As I stood there, staring at the man who had rewritten my childhood, I realized this was only the surface of a deeper machine, one that didn't stop at our front door. This house was a prototype, and I was about to see its blueprint everywhere. You might think this story is about one man and one mistake. It isn't. It's about how the world trains us to accept power disguised as protection, how we inherit submission like furniture. If you stay with me, I'll show you what hides behind that smile, that word, welcome. Because once you see it, you'll never walk through any doorway the same way again. They tell you control begins with laws or weapons. It doesn't. It begins with tone. The way a voice bends when it expects obedience. The pause that makes you fill the silence with agreement. Before anyone builds an empire, they test it in a living room. I started noticing it everywhere after that night, the cadence of command hiding inside everyday words. Be grateful, be patient, be reasonable, each phrase a leash made of politeness. I heard my stepfather's echo in teachers, in bosses, in headlines that told me who to fear and who to trust. Different uniforms, same rhythm. Power doesn't need bars, it only needs belief. If you can be taught that comfort equals safety, you'll guard your own cage. And they know this. They've always known. That's why the rules change just fast enough to keep you running after approval. You stop asking what you actually want, you ask what will be accepted. When I looked back on that house, I realized it wasn't unique. It was the smallest cell of a much larger organism. Families pass down the architecture of control the way others pass down heirlooms. Fathers to sons, teachers to students, leaders to followers, each thinking they're preserving order when they're really preserving fear. But here's the cruel genius. The system never names itself. It speaks through us, wearing our faces, our gestures, our affection. That's why rebellion feels like betrayal. It's not just defying someone else's rule, it's confronting the part of yourself that still believes in it. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. You start catching the micro-contracts, every nod, every apology made to keep peace at the cost of truth. That's where power feeds. In the gap between what you know and what you're allowed to say. Maybe that's why silence feels sacred and dangerous at the same time. Because somewhere inside it you can hear the first sound of freedom, doubt. The quiet refusal to keep rehearsing the script. If you've ever felt that chill, standing in a room you used to belong to and realizing the language there no longer fits, you've already started waking up. After you start noticing control around you, the next shock is finding it inside you. The echo becomes your own voice. You hear it when you stop yourself from speaking, when you rewrite a thought before it's fully formed. You think it's caution, but it's conditioning. I used to believe I was independent. I worked hard, kept quiet, stayed polite. I thought discipline was freedom, but what I'd really mastered was self-containment, the art of shrinking before anyone asked me to. Somewhere along the way, the system stopped needing guards, I became one. That's how power survives longest, not through punishment, but through imitation. Every rule I resisted as a child became a whisper in my head as an adult. Don't make them uncomfortable. Don't stand out. Don't ask why. Each whisper sounded reasonable, even moral. I called it being responsible. I called it maturity. But one night, staring at the ceiling that used to hum with my father's lessons, I realized I couldn't remember the last decision I made that was entirely my own. Every goal, every achievement, was a translation of someone else's expectation. I'd mistaken approval for purpose. Freedom, it turns out, isn't the absence of authority. It's the ability to confront the voice that sounds most like yours and ask, "Who taught you to speak to me that way?" The question terrified me, because the moment you ask it, the entire scaffolding of certainty trembles. You feel the world pull away, like gravity reconsidering its contract. That's when people retreat, back to comfort, back to rules, back to noise. But if you can stand in that silence a little longer, you'll sense a deeper current running beneath the fear. It's not rebellion, it's remembrance. The slow return of your original will before it was edited. I don't claim to have mastered it. Most days I still wake to the same commands, disguised as common sense. But now I recognize the disguise. Awareness doesn't erase the pattern, it exposes it. And exposure is where transformation begins. If you've ever caught yourself obeying a rule that no one enforced, pause and listen. That's the echo turning back into a voice. That's the first crack in the wall. The strangest thing about obedience is how beautifully it's packaged. They don't call it submission anymore, they call it responsibility. They don't call it silence, they call it professionalism. You learn to smile while tightening your own leash, and they hand you applause for it. I saw this pattern most clearly when I began to succeed. The higher I climbed, the quieter I became. Meetings taught me which opinions were strategic. Friendships taught me which truths were too heavy. Even grief was expected to be efficient, expressed in tasteful doses that wouldn't disturb anyone's comfort. That's how the architecture expands, not by force, but by reward. The system feeds on our desire to be good. It gives us metrics, promotions, validation, tokens that prove we belong. Each token whispers the same promise: stay in rhythm, and you'll be safe. At first, it feels like power. You tell yourself you've outgrown rebellion, that composure is strength. But strength without honesty becomes paralysis. The body might still move, but the will stops breathing. And because the world applauds the performance, you start mistaking the applause for air. It's subtle. You post the right thoughts, nod at the right times, manage your tone until it no longer sounds like you. The mask fits so well that removing it feels like losing your face. That's how most people stay asleep, lulled by the praise that comes from obedience disguised as virtue. I remember sitting in a room full of people nodding in unison, and realizing we weren't agreeing. We were synchronizing, every gesture rehearsed, every laugh timed. It wasn't malice, it was survival. We were terrified of being the one who broke the pattern. The day I finally did, the air changed. Conversations ended mid-sentence. The silence that followed was almost reverent, like the room itself was deciding whether to expel me or follow me out. That's when I understood. Truth doesn't fit politely. It arrives like a crack in the ceiling, quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. If you've ever felt the tension between who you are and who you're expected to be, don't rush to fix it, hold it. That friction is the birthplace of real will. The world calls it defiance. But it's simply the sound of a self returning home. There's a moment when resistance stops feeling like rebellion and starts feeling like oxygen. It doesn't happen all at once. It begins with a tremor, something small, like the breath you take before answering a question differently, for the first time in your life. You expect punishment. What you get instead is silence. And in that silence, you feel space. That's when the body remembers what freedom actually feels like. Not triumph, not noise, just the quiet pulse of being unobserved. The mind waits for correction, for the familiar voice to step in and tell you you're wrong. But no one does. You stand there, unedited, and realize the world didn't collapse. For me, it happened at work, during a meeting that had turned into ritual praise. My heart beat so loud it drowned out the rehearsed compliments. Then, without thinking, I asked the question everyone avoided. The words felt heavy, ancient, like something my father might have wanted to ask but never could. The room froze. Faces blinked. For a moment I thought I'd destroyed everything. Then someone else exhaled. Another voice followed mine, and another. Control systems feed on isolation. Once one person breaks rhythm, the illusion cracks. That's when I learned the first rule of awakening. Truth doesn't spread by persuasion. It spreads by permission. The days after felt strange. Every small decision carried new weight. I could feel old reflexes begging for order, for approval, for someone to define the edges again. But each time I resisted the urge to shrink, I grew. Not larger, but clearer. Power wasn't dominance, it was presence. the ability to stay fully awake while the world rehearsed sleep around me. That's the second rule: awareness costs comfort. You'll lose the easy belonging that comes from compliance. Friends who loved your silence may fear your voice. Systems that rewarded your obedience will question your sanity. It's the price of stepping off the map. Yet beneath the uncertainty, there's a strange calm, a sense that maybe all this chaos is what truth sounds like when it first enters a human life. So if you're listening and you've ever felt that tremor, that quiet defiance rising from somewhere older than fear, hold on to it. That's the doorway no one can guard. The moment you stop asking permission to exist, you start writing a language they can't erase. Awakening doesn't make you pure, it makes you powerful, and power always tests your motives. The first time I saw others still trapped in the old rhythm, I felt something dark flicker inside me, a superiority dressed as compassion. I told myself I wanted to help them see, but a quieter truth whispered that I wanted them to know that I saw first. That's how the system recycles itself, liberation turning into hierarchy. The newly awakened building a throne from insight. I began to speak with certainty, mistaking clarity for command. People listened, and I liked it. The attention felt righteous, almost holy. But then I caught my reflection one night. In a train window, city lights sliding over glass, and I saw my stepfather's posture in my own shoulders. Authority had found a new costume. It didn't need violence, it only needed conviction. That realization hit harder than any blow. The same energy that once silenced me now wanted to speak through me. That's when I understood the third rule of freedom: if you don't master the impulse to control, you'll become another link in the chain. So I began to listen instead of preach. Listening is dangerous work. When you truly hear people, their fear seeps into you. Their confusion claws at your certainty. You can't hide behind slogans or victories. You feel the weight of every mind still negotiating with its cage, and you realize liberation can't be given, it can only be remembered. The world doesn't need more prophets, it needs mirrors. People don't follow truth, they recognize it. My role wasn't to lead them out, but to remind them of exits they'd already built in their dreams. Now when I see someone frozen by obedience, I no longer reach for their hand. I clear the space around them, so they can feel how much room there really is. Because freedom isn't contagious, it's catalytic. That's the paradox. To stay awake, you have to resist even the seduction of being right. Every time you impose your vision, you replay the old order. Every time you choose humility over dominance, you widen the crack in the wall. Freedom isn't a victory you frame, it's maintenance. The morning after every revelation feels ordinary, almost dull. The dishes still need washing, deadlines still demand attention. Yet beneath the small motions, something steady hums, a different awareness of weight and choice. At first I thought awakening meant escape. I fantasized about vanishing from the noise, moving somewhere the system couldn't find me. But isolation is only another cage, built from pride instead of fear. The lesson wasn't to flee the world, it was to move through it without letting its rhythm set my pulse. So I began to practice stillness in motion. In conversations I noticed when my words reached for approval. In work I felt when ambition twisted into anxiety. Every time I caught the pattern and refused to tighten it, the pattern loosened a little more. Some days the old reflexes returned, whispering that humility was weakness, that calm meant apathy. But humility, I discovered, isn't submission, it's precision. It's the discipline of seeing reality without distortion. It lets you act cleanly, without the tremor of ego. The fourth rule of freedom formed itself there: power without presence decays. Real strength doesn't shout or defend itself, it moves like gravity, silent but undeniable. I began to understand why my father's calm once unsettled people. Stillness, when it's genuine, exposes the turbulence around it. With time, even my stepfather's memory changed shape. I stopped replaying the harm and started seeing the inheritance, the way pain teaches control, and control hides fear. It didn't absolve him, but it unhooked me. Forgiveness wasn't mercy, it was release. It meant I no longer needed him as proof of who I wasn't. Discipline became a kind of quiet rebellion. I woke early, worked deliberately, kept my attention like a blade. Not because someone demanded excellence, but because awareness deserved it. Each small act done consciously was a stone pulled from the wall. People began to notice. "You seem different," they'd say. I never knew how to answer. The truth was simple but impossible to explain. I hadn't become someone else. I'd stopped pretending. That's the work now. Not awakening once, but staying awake while the world drifts back to sleep. Every day a choice: contract or remain open, obey or observe, repeat or remember. Clarity, once steady inside you, begins to leak into the room. It isn't a sermon, it's a frequency. People sense it before they understand it. An ease in your shoulders, a pause before you answer, a refusal to rush toward the next opinion. At first they call it calm. Later they call it influence. But you know it's simply presence doing its quiet work. I noticed it at my job. Meetings that used to spiral in noise began to settle when I spoke less and listened fully. It wasn't authority that shifted the room, it was attention. True attention rearranges people. It reminds them that sincerity exists. And sincerity is contagious. The fifth rule revealed itself then. Transformation travels by resonance, not persuasion. When you hold awareness without forcing it, others remember their own. Some resist it, the noise fights to protect itself. But even resistance is proof that something inside them recognizes the sound. I stopped trying to fix conversations. Instead, I started holding space the way silence holds sound. Sometimes that meant letting tension breathe until honesty appeared. Other times it meant walking away before performance returned. Each moment felt like tuning an instrument I hadn't known I was playing. Slowly, the world around me began to mirror that rhythm. A colleague who never spoke started voicing ideas. A friend ended a long, stale apology cycle with his brother. Even my mother, once guarded, began asking questions she'd avoided for years. I didn't cause these shifts. I simply refused to feed the pattern that kept them small. That's how real change begins. Not with revolutions, but with micro-freedoms accumulating quietly until the old architecture loses weight. Systems weaken when people stop performing for them. But influence has its own shadow. The moment people sense peace, they want to brand it, bottle it, name it as guidance. The temptation returns to become the voice instead of the mirror. I remind myself daily, awareness isn't a banner to wave, it's a climate to maintain. Now when I enter any space, office, street, home, I ask one silent question: what is this room teaching me to be? And if the answer is smaller than who I am, I change the lesson. Not by defiance, but by remaining whole. That's how the collective begins. Not as a movement, but as many quiet people remembering at once that they were never property of the noise. There's a quiet cost to staying awake. At first it feels like strength, later it feels like hunger. You start to realize how few places welcome clarity. The world moves on velocity, noise, urgency, reaction, and when you stop feeding it, it forgets how to see you. Days blur, conversations thin out. The small circles that once defined you drift away, still chasing the comfort of agreement. You tell yourself it's fine, that solitude is proof of depth. But some nights the silence rings too loud, and you wonder if awakening was freedom or exile. That's the secret nobody mentions. Awareness burns energy. Every glance becomes analysis. Every word a test of authenticity. You miss the numbness sometimes, the easy warmth of conformity. It's tempting to slip back, to laugh when expected, to nod when tired, to let the current carry you. The mind whispers, would it really matter? One evening I caught my reflection again, tired eyes, calm face, and I realized fatigue is part of the training. Clarity isn't a posture, it's a pulse that needs rest. The sixth rule took shape then: rest is resistance too. The system wants you frantic, even in awakening. When you slow down, you starve it. So I began practicing quiet differently, not as withdrawal, but as nourishment. I read slower, walked without destination, let thoughts dissolve instead of demanding answers. In stillness, the noise of the world softened into something almost merciful, a reminder that even chaos runs out of breath. Sometimes doubt still visits, dressed as logic. It asks why any of this matters. Why not trade awareness for comfort? And the only reply worth giving is lived, not spoken, showing up each day without surrendering to numbness. Because doubt isn't the opposite of faith, it's faith asking for proof through endurance. There's a rhythm to this exhaustion. A dark tide that tests whether the awakening was real or just adrenaline. Those who mistake it for defeat sink back quietly. Those who stay still long enough to hear the deeper hum realize the fatigue itself is guidance. It means you've stopped drawing energy from illusion. When you reach that edge, don't run from it. Sit there. Let the tiredness wash through until it becomes transparency again. Behind it waits the next layer of strength, the kind that no longer fights to be seen. When the exhaustion finally broke, it didn't end in triumph, it ended in quiet. I woke one morning and realized I wasn't pushing anymore. No grand vision, no crusade. Just an ordinary day waiting to be lived without pretense. That, I learned, is the real aftermath of awakening. Nothing looks different, but everything feels lighter. The old hunger for meaning had burned itself out, leaving room for something simpler, purpose without performance. I began to see work not as a ladder but as craft, conversation not as persuasion but as exchange. The world hadn't changed, my relationship to it had. That's the seventh rule of freedom: after the storm, build small. Grand gestures still belong to ego, quiet consistency belongs to awareness. When you move from clarity, every small act becomes a declaration. Making breakfast, answering a message with patience, finishing what you start. Don't vanish, they disguise themselves as nostalgia. But I stopped trying to erase the past. Instead, I treated every echo of control as evidence of progress. It only echoed because silence had replaced the original sound. The most surprising part was the children. They watched more than they listened. When they saw adults speak plainly and stay gentle, they mirrored it. The cycle that once passed fear now passed calm. Generational repair doesn't begin with apology. It begins with example. I realized then that awakening isn't personal salvation. It's environmental restoration. The moment you become whole, your presence reteaches gravity. People stand straighter, breathe easier, dream wider. That's how a lineage heals, not through declarations, but through ordinary days lived consciously enough to remind the world what balance feels like. I stood again on the same porch. The paint had faded, the railings still leaned slightly, but the air no longer carried threat. The echo of that first welcome back drifted through memory, no longer a trigger, just a sound that had lost its power. That day I realized the circle had closed. All those years I had tried to win against what broke me. But wholeness doesn't come from victory, it comes from release. The past had done its work. Its violence carved the space where awareness now lived. Without it, I might never have learned to see. I whispered the phrase again, welcome back, and felt what it really meant. Not his words, mine, a homecoming to myself. Every scar became instruction, every silence became strength. The wound had been the doorway, not the wall. That's the final rule: return without resentment. Because the moment you step back into the places that shaped you and stay calm, you've rewritten the architecture of memory itself. The power that once held you dissolves, unable to feed on fear it no longer owns. I walked through the house slowly, touching the wood my father once measured, hearing his quiet precision in each corner. I understood now. The work of generations isn't to stay unbroken, but to learn how to mend beautifully. When I left, the door creaked the same way it always had, but now it sounded like permission. I didn't need to prove survival, I simply embodied it. That's what awakening does. It turns history from gravity into guidance. So if you're listening now, wondering whether the pain ever releases its grip, this is your sign. It does. Not all at once, and never through forgetting, but through presence. Through the courage to meet every echo and answer it with awareness instead of rage. Welcome back. To the life that was always yours, to the power that no one can own, to the quiet, steady strength of finally belonging to yourself. Because once you return like that, the world itself exhales.